Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Red Path. It's Dara here with you again today, and we are going to be talking about all the new stratagems from Codex World Eaters. So grab yourselves a brew and let's dive in. Okay, welcome back everyone. So today we're going to be talking about all the stratagems from the World Eaters section of our new codex, so Codex World Eaters. So the way I phrase it like that is because we're not really going to be talking about the disciples of the Red Angel stratagems today. We're actually going to be covering all that subfaction goodness in a separate video at a later point. So today we're just going to be focusing on the 8 main stratagems that are in the basic subfaction version of our book. So let's have a quick run through them here. We're going to go for a little bit of a different style of video today because I have some fun examples that I want to show you here. So starting from the top, we have the Red Butchers, which is a 2 CP stratagem for both the Red Butchers and the 8-bound, so 8-bound keyword, which means you can use it on the Exalted 8-bound as well. And what it does is it gives these guys +1 to their damage rolls, which is pretty interesting. We're going to dive into that one in a little bit. Next up, we have Gory Dismemberment. Now, this is a 1 CP stratagem to just dump a load of mortal wounds on wound rolls of 6s, so to a maximum of 6 mortal wounds in close combat. And this can be used on a core or a character. So some nice options there for who you can put this stratagem on. Then we have Skulls for the Skull Throne, which is a 1 or 2 CP stratagem and must be used when one of your characters kills the opposing warlord, granting you either 2 blood tide points or +1 to advance and charge for the rest of the game. Or if you spend 2 CP, you get both of those effects. So pretty niche stratagem, I must say. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into it. Then we have Scorn of Sorcery. It's 1 CP. It's a classic 4+ deny from any World Eaters unit with a 24-inch range. Was good before and it will remain to be good again. Then we have Blood Frenzy. Now this is an interesting one. It's 1 or 2 CP depending on if you use it on troops or not. So it's discounted if you use it on troops, but it must be used on core. And effectively what it is Fight on Death, which as we know is an incredibly powerful mechanic in the game. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we get into it. Then we have Aggressive Intervention, which is also 1 CP and is used on core units. Now this is actually my favorite stratagem. What it does is it allows a core unit to have a 6-inch heroic intervention move as if it were a character, which in my opinion is actually one of the most powerful abilities that we are going to have access to, and in the hands of a good player will be really, really powerful. I'm going to give you some examples in a little bit about different situations in which that would be useful, but it's by no means the full limit of all the different kind of ways that you can use that stratagem. It's going to be really fun to dive into that one, I think. We also have the Icon of Wrath, which is 1 CP and keyworded to any units that have an icon, so just Berserkers and Jackals. And what it does is it gives them a 3d6 charge, picking the 2 highest dice. So that's an incredibly powerful ability for a variety of different reasons, but namely for using it on anything coming in from a reserves or deep strike roll. So like things coming out of a drill or a dreadclaw or coming in from strategic reserves. Then we have the ever useful Smokescreen, which is 1 CP, works on your Land Raiders, potentially Land Raiders, I'm actually not sure about that one, but definitely works on your Rhinos, and it gives them -1 to hit when they are selected as a target. So we know it, we love it, we've seen it all before. But let's dive into the details. So first up, we're going to talk a little bit about the Red Butchers. So this one, like I said, costs 2 CP and is used on your 8-bound and your Terminators, depending on which variety of 8-bound you have. What it does is it actually pushes a lot of their weapons into interesting damage territory, which is an easy enough thing to say, but when you actually look at the ramifications of where the damage ends up going, it can actually make these units really, really good at mincing the targets that they might be going into. So for example, Terminators, they're going to be really good when they go into Marines. 8-bound, they're going to blend when they go up to damage 3 or damage 4, depending on what weapons they have. So it actually makes 8-bound a real big threat for enemy vehicles, which is something that the World Eaters lack in general. We don't really have access to infantry units that can reliably mince vehicles until you put 2 CP on a unit of either regular or exalted 8 bound. Especially the exalted, it's going to kick them up to damage 4, and with the volume of attacks they have at AP minus 4, they're going to go straight through most light transports or even medium sized tanks. It also makes regular 8 bound blend Custodes and Terminators, which is again something that we historically do struggle a little bit with in close combat, especially 3 wound Custodes when we have a lot of ubiquitous damage 2. Being able to push the 8 bound up to damage 3 and just straight up kill Custodes makes them really, really reliable at blending those hard shift squads. And regular Terminators as well, coming in at the 3 wound mark, we've got the right amount of AP and now the right amount of damage to reliably just pick up Terminator squads, which is amazing. The damage for lacerators on either the 8 bound champion or the exalted 8 bound is really interesting because it actually becomes relevant when we're fighting 2 Death Guard Terminators or Dreadnoughts with -1 damage. It's a little bit more niche, but still quite decent overall. And in general, the 5-man Terminator blob bumping up to damage 2 just means that they're going to reliably mince any form of Space Marine or Space Marine equivalent, which, doesn't sound that impressive. We don't really struggle with that too much, but it just means that we have a squad that is a little bit more reliable at the thing that we want them to do, which is great. So overall, I would put this stratagem at a B tier, I think, because of its slightly situational use and maybe not necessarily being useful in every single combat phase, as opposed to some of our other stratagems, which I think will be used almost all the time. So let's move on from that one. So next up, we have the aptly named Gory Dismemberment for 1 CP. Now, this is probably going to be one that's used by most people in most games most of the time for a variety of reasons, because it is a source of casual mortal wounds, which is something that a lot of armies have, and previously we didn't really have a crazy amount of access to. But what it does is when you get wound rolls of 6s in close combat, they just become an additional mortal wound on top of the regular damage, to a maximum of 6 mortal wounds per phase. So that's really cool because it works on basically our core units and our character units. So you'll notice that a lot of these stratagems are core locked, which is kind of an important consideration when you're building your list, is kind of what stratagems you're going to have access to as well as what abilities. But being able to push a core unit into the territory of just effectively clearing out the target that they're going into by dumping mortal wounds, like this unsavable amount of damage on top of a unit, it's just really, really powerful. One thing that I think it's really good for is helping Angron comfortably take out enemy knights. It's not like he really necessarily struggles at killing them in the first place, but it's kind of 50-50 some of the time, especially if they have an invulnerable save in combat. If you slap Gory Dismemberment on Angron, you're effectively guaranteed to get the 6 mortal wounds with him and make sure that that knight gets picked up. What it also does is really help Berserker squads become extremely reliable into slightly tougher targets that they might struggle with. So maybe, targets that equal their strength. So if targets are toughness 6, or things that just happen to have a good save, maybe a 2+ base save, which goes to a 4 after their chain blades. So if you just want that extra surety of making sure that the squad will pick up the target, then Gory Dismemberment on a unit of Berserkers is really, really effective. To be honest, I don't think 8 bound really benefit that much from this one, as most of the time they are going to pick up their targets anyway, so it can end up being a bit redundant if you do spend it on them. But as always, when you are throwing more dice, you get more value out of stratagems like this. So like I said, using it on Angron, you're basically guaranteed to get the mortal wounds. And using it on bigger Berserker squads as well, you're almost guaranteed to roll the 6/6s and get the maximum amount of value from the stratagem. So overall, I put this one at a B+ tier, mainly because it's just really good if you need that reassurance to finish off a combat. Like, you can just slap this on for 1 CP. It's very, very cheap, and kind of feel a lot more confident about the fight that you're going into. Skulls for the Skull Throne is the next stratagem that's up on the list, and this is an interesting one. It is either 1 or 2 CP, depending on how much of the stratagem you end up using. And effectively, what it does is it either gives you 2 Blood Tide points or +1 to your advance and charge for the rest of the game when one of your characters kills the enemy warlord. So there's a lot of criteria that have to be filled here, which means it's a highly situational stratagem that's only going to come up occasionally. And not only that, when the situation actually arises that you can use the stratagem, you have to remember that it is an option. And with the amount of things going on in a game of 40k, it's not always easy to budget that cost in to your CP allotment every turn, and also to even remember that it's there as an option. We all forget things in the heat of the moment. It's going to be a lot more prevalent versus those mid to lower tier opponents, because effectively what you're asking your opponent to do is give you their warlord, and not only give you their warlord but also position their warlord in a way where one of our characters can actually jump out and get him. Now, our characters aren't particularly amazing at, jumping in and sniping unless you're using things like Invocatus or Demon Prince. So you are really just relying on your enemy or your opponent making a mistake here if you actually want to use this stratagem, which, like I said, kind of feeds into the whole highly situational thing. And against good opponents, of decent skill level, they're just not going to make that mistake. They're not going to give you that option. The latter half of the stratagem, so the +1 to advance and charge, is really only useful on Angron, but it is actually very, very useful when you do get the option to use it on Angron, because adding +1 to his charge means that when he is killed and inevitably resurrected, he's going to have a 7-inch charge from Deep Strike if you're combining it with the Blood Tide point effect for extra bonus to your charge roll. So overall, I think I would put this one at a C tier, mainly because it's just super, super situational. You have to remember that it's there. You have to have the CP budgeted for it. And I just don't really see that many people using it that often. So the Icon of Wrath, 1 CP for 3d6 charge, picking the 2 highest dice on an icon unit. So our Jackals and our Berserkers. 2 really, really nice units that I think we're going to see an awful lot of in the game. So this is a really fun stratagem for a bunch of different reasons. 3d6 charge, pick the 2 highest, is just a really good way of, kind of making sure that you're going to make that charge roll. So where this comes up most is when you're using your reserves and your Deep Strike. So strategic reserves are free now. You can just pop a unit of Berserkers into reserves at the start of the game. As long as they have an icon, when they pop out, maybe you've got the Blood Tide buff up, they're going to be hitting an 8-inch charge on 3d6, picking the 2 highest, which is fairly reliable. And importantly, if you do fail that charge and you use a CP for a reroll, you get to reroll all 3 dice because you've already spent the stratagem. So that's pretty nice. And where it's really, really cool is when you've got guys coming out of deep striking transports. So anyone who is a fan of the channel knows I am a big fan of these transports because they are Drills, Dreadclaws, and the mighty Charybdis Assault Claw. So Drills are really, really good in our new codex for a variety of different reasons. Benefiting from the Blood Tide, they get access to a lot of really cool buffs that they wouldn't have had before. But the value of bringing a Drill in the mid game just went up an awful lot with this stratagem, because if you have a big Berserker squad hopping out of a Drill and they've got an 8-inch charge on 3d6, they're almost certainly going to be making that charge, which just makes that whole play an awful lot more reliable than it has been before, which was a big thing that was kind of holding it back. And I think once we get the Imperial Armor FAQ, we're going to see a lot of people start to look at the Termite Drill again as an option for a sort of mid-game injection of Berserkers in the place where they're needed the most. Dreadclaws are also a really interesting option. A lot of people are talking about Dreadclaws as they work well in any of the kind of Alpha Strike pressure lists that we're building. And, the ability to come down turn 1, if you're putting a squad of Berserkers or Jackals into your opponent's face immediately, you're forcing them to make difficult decisions. And by that extent, the Charybdis is also a really interesting pick because it can just deposit a much bigger squad of Jackals or 2 squads of Berserkers, one of which is getting that bonus to the charge. So, like I'm saying, when you use it with the Blood Tide points, it just makes these reserve charges really, really reliable, which is great. And in pressure builds like those involving Invocatus and the squads of 8-band running up the board at the start of the game, having a having a Dreadclaw or a Charybdis dropping in alongside these units means you can be charging your opponent's lines with 4 or 5 units in the first turn. At that point, you can be doing a significant amount of damage if they haven't screened you out well. And one thing I really like is the fact that this actually does work on Jackals as a stratagem, because you can bait out your opponent in the sort of like running through your list phase of the game where you're talking about the Dreadclaw, and they're going to see that and straight away they're going to assume that you're putting a unit of Berserkers in there. But actually, if you anticipate them screening you out, if you see that they have a lot of casual chaff infantry that they're just going to throw away as a screen, what you can do is put a squad of Jackals inside that drop pod and bring that in turn 1, and they will surely blend the screen, giving you Blood Tide points, but also not throwing away a Berserker squad for no reason, which is really, really nice. So overall, I would put that stratagem at a B+ tier, mainly because it's really, really useful if you are using those kind of reserves or deep strike units. But if you're not using those units, it kind of loses a lot of its use, I think. So we're going to roll the next two stratagems into one because we kind of know what they do already from previous codexes. It's Scorn of Sorcery and Smokescreen, both of which are 1 CP. You know, the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, kind of applies here because both these stratagems were useful before and they're going to continue to be useful, but they are slightly better than they used to be because the economy of how our CP works is kind of different now. Mainly because we don't spend a lot of CP in the pre-game, and also we have less things to spend CP on because a lot of the things that we used to use command points for was buffing our combat, improving our ability in combat with things like Wild Frenzy and all those other good stuff from the old book, but we don't actually have those anymore. They're baked into our Blood Tide now, which means that we have more CP freed up to actually use Scorn of Sorcery and Smokescreen, which is interesting. We're going to be running more rhinos, at least initially anyway, which makes Smokescreen more valuable naturally, which is fine. And the combination of Scorn and the 5 up Feel No Pain from the Blood Tithe is a great meme if you're playing into a Psyker heavy army, in my opinion. It doubles the kind of trolling ability that our army has at just negating psychic powers. And if you happen to throw in Fleshhounds or a Brass Scorpion, you can really up the ante to make us actually quite a potent anti-psychic army, which is quite amusing. Overall, though, I would put both of these at C tier, mainly because they're not incredibly useful. I was never really a fan of Scorn of Sorcery because any stratagem that works half the time is a waste of CP, in my opinion. It's just annoying that you have to use it sometimes when there's a really important power that has to go off, and it's either going to feel bad for you or your opponents at the end of the day, which, I'm not really a fan of that mechanic. Smokescreen, again, it's fine. You'll use it sometimes. Most of the time, it might not even matter, but there'll be the odd game where you're like, wow, I'm really glad I used that. So we're going to move on to the two really, really interesting stratagems now, and we're going to start with Aggressive Intervention. Now, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about these stratagems just because I think they have an awful lot of play, and there's some really interesting examples that I've drafted up here that we're going to kind of run through and talk about. So Aggressive Intervention, first of all, is a 1 CP stratagem, and like I said, it gives one of your core units a 6-inch heroic intervention. This is a really, really powerful ability for something that I call zone control, which is basically the amount of the board that you control with your units at a given time. Now, this isn't necessarily the actual footprint of the unit, it's more what area is that unit currently threatening. So if you have the ability for any of your core units, any of them at all, to have a 6-inch heroic intervention, that means that each one of these units has a 6-inch radius bubble coming out from each model where they are a threat during your opponent's turn. That's very, very powerful and very scary. It will dictate where your opponent moves a lot of the time. Anyone who's played Custodes regularly knows how scary it is to have, a unit of Custodian Guard intervene into you. It will force your opponent to move in specific ways. You'll be able to funnel them into some areas to kind of dictate where they're going to go, but it just means that you have to set that thing up either in the end of your charge or combat phase or your movement phase, depending on whether or not you're engaging the enemy in combat during your turn. Because of the nature of the stratagem, it can be a bit of a gotcha moment if your opponent wasn't really expecting it, and it can lead to a feel bads if they're kind of like, oh, I didn't really necessarily know you could do that, or I moved my guys there and kind of forgot that you had that ability. So, here on the Red Path, we're all about kind of fair play and letting your opponent know about these gotcha moments. So during games like this, we've had it before with the Master of Executions. I would always remind my opponent, like, hey, you're moving here just so you know I can intervene into you. That's not necessarily devaluing the stratagem. It's just letting your opponent know that you control this area of the board. And if they're willing to take that risk and continue with their move, maybe sometimes they don't have a choice, then that's up to them. But at least they know that in advance and they won't feel like, they've had this little gotcha moment played on them, or like, you've activated the trap card, basically. We try to avoid those situations in games for good sportsmanship. It is very, very powerful when it's played or when you set up your units around objectives, and we're going to dive into that with some of the examples, but it basically can allow you to control what's happening on an objective, even if you're not necessarily standing on it. Or if you are standing on it, it can control who's going to be there at the end of the turn. So we're going to dive into that. So yeah, like I'm saying, it gives you this whole pile of agency and control during your opponent's turn, which we would never have had before outside of the Master of Executions, and opens up an awful lot of interesting play, especially when combined with the Berserker's Blood Surge move, which we're going to talk about too. And it's extra movement. Extra movement out of phase is one of the best and most powerful things that you can have in your arsenal. This is it in a nutshell. You're effectively getting a full turn of movement in your opponent's turn, which is outstanding, as we all know from double activating Red Butchers before. It has a very high skill ceiling, and effectively utilizing this stratagem is not very easy to do, at least initially, but understanding how to set up your units in your movement phase to control where your opponent moves his units in his movement phase, it's a skill in itself, and it's going to come with time, so don't expect to master it straight away. But overall, I would put this at an A tier stratagem, and it's one that if you have good knowledge and good understanding of movement, you're going to be able to use this to great effect. So let's take a look at some examples. So what we have here is some berserkers and some intercessors. Let's say they are Imperial Fists because they're yellow. We have this blue circle here which represents an objective. So what we have is our berserkers hanging out on the objective, and we have these intercessors hovering on the edge, and it's our opponent's turn, right? So he's going to move on to the objective. This is just the most basic version of the play, right? He's going to move on to it. He's got more guys than we do, which means he technically controls it. But what we're going to do is basically heroically intervene into him with the 1 CP aggressive intervention, and then pop, because we can't, he doesn't count as a charging unit, which means we'll get to fight first in this case. So we're going to pick up all those intercessors and take back the unit, as well as getting a cheeky little 3-inch consolidation move at the end, which is nice. It's a really simple version of the play, nothing too complicated there. Here's another situation. It's kind of the same thing, but it's more interesting because we have a ruin on this objective, which is a situation that occurs a lot of the time. There's usually a building there. So what we've done is we've set up our berserkers inside this ruin. It's a staging area now. So what we have is this area of the board where we're kind of hiding in, and our opponent can't really interact with us. We can't be shot from inside here, which means if he wants to threaten this objective at all, he's either going to have to charge our berserkers or face the fact that we're just going to jump in and heroically intervene into him and kill him off the objective again, which is a really, really nice play. If you see buildings on objectives, that's what you want to be setting up for. Another version of the play, which this is a cheeky little one here and utilizes the Berserker's Blood Surge move. So we're going to have a situation here where we have our Assault Intercessors, and they're going to open up on our Berserkers. We're going to lose 1, maybe 2, right? So what we're going to do then is we're going to activate our Blood Surge move. And let's say we get a 3 or a 4, and we're going to yeet ourselves up onto the objective, which is really nice. We're on the objective now, but we're probably not controlling it because he's got maybe a couple more guys. However, the problem is we've now managed to Blood Surge into aggressive intervention range. So we're going to spend that CP and we're going to end up inside fighting our opponent. So these are all problems that our opponent is going to have to solve during their turn. It's going to force them to make more decisions, which means they're more likely to make a mistake. And if we can spot those mistakes, like these situations here, such as shooting the Berserkers, we can capitalize on them and end up getting a positive outcome in our opponent's turn, which is really powerful. This is a nice little one called to illustrate the zone control that I was talking about. So what we have here is a similar situation. Our Berserkers aren't on the objective here, neither are the Intercessors hanging out in the corner. But if we look at that radius of 6 inches around all our Berserkers, we can see that there is an awful lot of the area of the board that is kind of basically, if you walk into it, it's going to be a threat. I will be able to pop this stratagem and intervene into the intercessors, which is nice, right? This right here is roughly the area that they're going to be covering. But if we string out the berserkers, our area increases drastically. We get a much bigger footprint of zone control, which means that like all these individual circles, all of them correspond to the 6-inch heroic intervention ability of one of these berserkers, which means that we can dictate what happens inside any of these circles. So as soon as our opponent steps into one of those circles, they're going to be in range of that ability, which means they have to make a choice. Are they going to charge those berserkers, or are they going to let them intervene into them? So in this situation, the assault intercessors have stepped onto the objective, which has moved into our range, and we've popped in just like that. And we are basically going to pick them up off the objective. Now, a lot of these situations are going to net us a lot of benefits, from secondary victory points to blood tide points as well. So some of the things that we've gained in a typical play of using aggressive intervention are we usually gain control of an objective. We can gain 1 or potentially more blood tide points. If we're using Blood God's Due and we've intervened onto an objective, we've gained a point there. And we've also gained a point for Blood for the Blood God because we've killed a unit in close combat during our opponent's turn. So that's a really big profit gained during what is not even our player turn for 1 CP. So the returns that you can get from that stratagem are wild, in my opinion. This is the last little play that I'm going to illustrate with the aggressive intervention. It's what I call the bait and trap, and it's probably my favorite one. So what we have here is a squad of berserkers hanging out in the objective. They're the bait, and then we have the trap inside the building. So the situation here is you present your opponent with an option. They have a nice juicy target and an objective which they want to get into with a charge move, but then we use our heroic intervention to jump on in here and take them out, regaining control of the objective and netting all those nice benefits that we spoke about before. These are just some of the ways that you can use aggressive intervention. There's an awful lot more, but I hope it does highlight some of the different ideas that you can kind of stage around this. Like I said, there's tons of different things you can do with this, but it's a very, very versatile stratagem, and I can see good players using it all the time. So let's talk about Blood Frenzy next. Blood Frenzy is 1 or 2 CP, depending on if you use it on troops or not, but it is locked to core. And what it does is it gives you access to one of the strongest abilities in the game, Fight on Death, which if we have played into Creations of Bile, or I think it was Dark Harlequins before they were nerfed, it's an incredibly oppressive ability. In a lot of different kind of... It's effectively a second combat interrupt during your opponent's turn. You know, you can set up these situations where if they've multi-charged across the board, you're going to be able to fight on doubt with one unit and interrupt with another, which just is a nightmare for your opponent to have to deal with and forces an awful lot of annoying decisions on them. And it's basically a free trade out, right? A lot of the time. And realistically, we're going to be using it on berserkers most of the time, so it's only going to cost us 1 CP to potentially just make it so that there's no one on an objective, or it's an even trade at the very, very least. So like I said, it forces your opponent into these horrible, difficult decisions about where they charge and how many units they commit to a fight, because already it's difficult to make that decision with a combat interrupt in play, but when you have Blood Frenzy as well, it's just a nightmare. And it's kind of leading me to believe that we're always going to want 3 or 4 CP during our opponent's turn, which I think we will be able to, because most of our really good combat buffs are tied to the Blood Tithe instead of command points. So this can be especially horrible if your opponent is playing a close combat army, because they're trying to do what we're trying to do, but typically we're going to be doing it better now and making them have to make worse decisions during their turn. It also has a lot of psyops value, so the kind of getting in your opponent's head factor, right? Because if they're having to consider these things, you know, they're likely to make a mistake at some point, or make a mistake at a different juncture, which might open up the aggressive intervention that we just talked about as well, right? It's stacking all these different but similar stratagems on top of each other and understanding how to set up kind of set pieces and situations where they can kind of overlap, that your opponent is kind of forced into these horrible decision-making trees and they will inevitably make a mistake. So this is another A-tier stratagem for me, and it combines really, really well with aggressive intervention for some lovely decisions and power. You know, again, we're controlling things during our opponent's turn, which is exactly what we want to be doing. So let's look at Blood Frenzy. Here's just a really typical example. We have our good friends, these intercessors, here again, going to our berserkers. So they jump on in and they probably kill all our berserkers pretty easily, because maybe it's the combat doctrine, or maybe they just kill them, because that's kind of what happens sometimes. So we're going to spend 1 CP to fight on death, and we're just going to kill them back, which means at the end of this, they don't gain anything. They lose control of the objective. They don't take our objective away. What we end up getting is a point for Blood God's Due for using it, and we get a Blood Tide point. We actually get 2 here in this case, my apologies. So we get a net gain from this, and your opponent is left with nothing, which is nice, but that's a really basic use of the stratagem. This is probably more like what we're actually going to be seeing. So what we have here are 3 different units on either side. We have up top, we have 1 squad of berserkers. Inside the ruin, we have another squad. And down at the bottom, we have 3 8-bound. And on our opponent's side, we have 2 intercessor squads and maybe a Terminator squad down here at the bottom. So he's going to come in, he's going to charge with all 3 units and tie up all of our units. But this is where the decision paralysis comes in. Where does he fight first? Let's say he fights down at the bottom with the 8-bound, because that's going to force our hand and make us spend 2 CP instead of 1 on fight last, which isn't a bad play. But that means that he hasn't fought with either of the intercessor squads into the berserkers, meaning that we can combat interrupt at a later point with them. But let's focus on the 8 bound for now, and we're going to do our 2 CP fight on death. Now, unless we spend points on the Red Butchers, which we may or may not have, we're probably not going to wipe the squad. So let's say, optimistically, we kill 4 in this situation. That's still a really good trade. That's 4 dead Terminators. Then what we're going to do is use 2 CP to interrupt combat and wipe out the Intercessor squad up top, meaning the objective is back in our control. Now, probably what's going to happen after that is our Berserker squad gets taken out inside the ruin, which is fair enough, and he'll consolidate onto the objective. But because we took out the Intercessor squad up top, we consolidated down, so we have more bodies on the objective, meaning it's back in our control. Again, netting us a variety of different things like Blood Tide points, victory points for our various secondaries, and overall, we come out on top again. So, in summary, let's talk about all our stratagems. They're all valuable in different ways, but they are all good. There's nothing here that I would never ever use. There are some that are more situational than others, but they all have their place in our lists, I believe. Most importantly, they give us agency and zone control, like we talked about, especially with aggressive intervention. That's the real powerful one. The agency comes in then with Blood Frenzy from the fight on death, giving you more options, more things to do during your opponent's turn. So those 2 things are incredibly powerful, as well as providing us with things like additional movement from the intervention and the pylons and consolidates that will happen after that, as well as giving us more reliability, the form of like gory dismemberment, just making sure that we confirm those kills, which is great. They're all relatively cheap as well, which is really, really interesting. I can see some of these stratagems going up in cost because I think some of them are exceptionally undercosted. And in an economy where we're spending kind of points on Blood Tide abilities instead of command points, we actually have more CP to play with. So these stratagems seem even more valuable because we have more resource to use in the first place compared to what we had in, we'll say, the 9th edition Chaos Space Marine Codex. But overall, you know, it's a fantastic thing. The list is really, really powerful and gives us an awful lot of different options. That is essentially a run through of our stratagems. Now, we deep dove into some of the more important ones, the ones that I think people are going to need to kind of understand and get their heads around a little bit more. But like I say, every single one of them is going to be useful. And we haven't even started talking about the Disciples of the Red Angel as well, which I firmly believe has got a lot of play. It's been kind of fun to put this one together. I hope the diagrams and illustrations helped with understanding what I was trying to convey with the power of some of these stratagems. But I think the most important takeaway here is that this gives us more control than we've ever had before. And when combined with the output from the Blood Tithe, makes us an incredibly potent force on the battlefield. So I hope this video has been informative. Let me know what you thought of it down below in the comments. If you haven't already, jump into our Discord, where we're always talking about interesting interactions like these and coming up with new ideas and ways of using our stratagems and other abilities. Like the channel, give it a subscribe. You know, we're trying to grow ourselves here, and all the support that you can give us is greatly appreciated. So until then, and until the next video, folks, you stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.